So welcome people who are entering the room. It's a bit hard. We can't see you. Hopefully you can see us well. We'll wait another minute or so to give people a chance to join. All right, well, in the interests of time, we might get started. So I'm Gabriele Bammer. I'm the president of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. Some of you might have seen a video of me on the first day. Jason, if I could have the first slide, please. The next slide, please. Thank you. So given that those of us who are speaking are in Australia and Jason and Michael are in Sydney, we would like to give an acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of this is the way an Australian acknowledgement of country works. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose ancestral lands the UTS, University of Technology Sydney campus stands. And I'd like to pay respects to the elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for the land. I further like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which other attendees join us today. I'm joining from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra, and also pay the respects to those elders past and present. I know many of you aren't from Australia, and the Australians who are will understand this. Those of you who aren't will have your own traditions for acknowledging the Indigenous people and the history of colonisation and the damage that's wrought. The next slide, please. So today's session has been organised and supported heavily by the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, and also by the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. If I can have the next slide, please. So we're going to have 4 parts. I'm giving the introduction now. Then Michael O'Rourke will speak on the background, conceptualising failure and the survey that he and Dina Pham did on failure. Following that, Jason Pryor will talk about learning from failure and the norms and rules guiding inter and transdisciplinary research. And then we'll open it for a discussion. So while I'm doing the introduction, perhaps you could use the chat to introduce yourselves to each other, and that would also help us see who's online. Also use the chats to share your thoughts, but if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function. And at the end, I'll be monitoring that and asking your questions of the panel. It would be, as you probably know, this session is being recorded. So if you would prefer not to be visible on the recording, please keep a low profile. We won't be able to see you unless you enter your name in the chat or into the Q&A. So let me move on and introduce the first speaker, Michael O'Rourke. Michael's a professor of philosophy at Michigan State University in the United States. He's also on the faculty of Ag Bio Research and Environmental Science and Policy. He's probably best known to those of us in Inter and Transdisciplinarity as the Executive Director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. And this is a research and practice group that focuses on philosophical approaches to facilitating cross-disciplinary research. He was the former director of the Michigan State University Centre for Interdisciplinarity. And his primary interests are in interdisciplinary theory, epistemology, communication, and epistemic integration in research that's collaborative and cross-disciplinary. So he's somebody that many of us look up to and admire for the work that he's done. And it's been really influential in the field, and you'll hear about some of it today. Our second speaker will be Jason Pryor from the University of Technology, Sydney, where he's Professor of Planning, Health and Environment at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. There he leads the graduate Inter and Transdisciplinary Research program, which includes 62 PhD students. And he's also a research director at that institute. His research encompasses the institutionalization of inter and transdisciplinary research, education and practice. And I'm delighted to say that he's just been re-elected to the leadership board of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. So, Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gabriele. Excellent. I wanted to wish everyone a good day and also gratitude to those of you in Utrecht for getting up early to join us for the session. Thank you very much. I am going to spend a few minutes introducing you to the background of this project. I'll talk a little bit about how we conceptualized failure in the project, and then end by describing in a little bit of detail the failure survey that Dina Pham and I conducted back in 2019. We have two goals for this presentation today. The first goal is describing the normative landscape of inter and transdisciplinary research using the institutional grammar tool. So the institutional grammar tool is a tool originally developed by Eleanor Ostrom and colleagues, and Jason will talk about it in his part of the presentation. We use the term normative landscape as a kind of evocative way of getting you to think about what you need to do if you want to successfully engage in inter or transdisciplinary research, right? What are the standards or success conditions that distinguish successful ITD from failed ITD? So the first goal involves describing some of those success conditions. The second goal is to essentially provide a kind of proof of concept for how you can use failure data to inform the successful practice of ITD. People like to talk about learning from failure, using failure to inform success. I think we do that in life all the time, but we don't necessarily do that systematically in professional practice all that often. And what we'd like to do is provide an example, basically demonstrate one way of systematically learning from failure. I'll begin with the background. This is a project that actually was originally conceived at an ITD meeting back in Lüneburg, Germany in 2017. So Dina and I ate a meal together, the last meal of that conference, and hatched a plan to examine failure in inter and transdisciplinary research. We got to talking about, about what inter and transdisciplinary research was. We were both convinced, right, that as I think most of us are, that inter and transdisciplinary research projects are more complex than disciplinary projects in a host of ways. And for this reason, it was our sense that inter and transdisciplinary research projects fail more frequently than disciplinary research projects. But really that amounted to nothing more than kind of a hunch or a hypothesis that we both shared. But we were excited about that and about the kind of common ground that we enjoyed together when it came to this topic. And so we decided that we'd start collaborating. And our collaboration generated initially a couple of goals. First of all, we wanted to edit a volume that would collect case studies of inter and transdisciplinary failure. And then secondly, we thought it would be a good idea to conduct a survey of the community so that we could gather information about experiences of failure in inter and transdisciplinary projects. The first goal was achieved in 2021 when we published the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary failures with Routledge. This book contains 13 case studies and a coda by Julie Thompson-Klein. And the whole point of the book really was to provide detailed case studies that would enable people to learn from other folks' failure. So they could take, to sort of treat these case studies as cautionary tales and design their own projects in ways that would be, if not immune to those kinds of failures, at least sensitive to them, so that hopefully they could avoid those that kind of downturn of fortune that the authors of the contributions to that book described. The second goal was achieved in 2019, actually a bit earlier. We developed a survey and then disseminated it with the help of Dr. Bammer's I2 Insights blog and Science of Team Science listserv, among other listservs. The results of that survey were reported in a preliminary way in Gothenburg at the ITD 2019 meeting. and then in the introductory chapter of the Rutledge volume. This presentation really is a continued effort to get signal out of the data that we collected with that failure survey. All right. One of the first things that we realized we needed to do, Dina and me, when we started this project together, was we needed to figure out how we were going to describe failure to the people we were going to invite to contribute to the volume, and also in thinking through what our survey would be like. We needed to have a conception that we could communicate clearly and that would resonate with the community. There's a lot of work on failure in the literature, in literatures in business, management, organizational management, engineering, and other locations. And within the contributions to those literatures, you'll find a variety of different definitions. The definitions are kind of all more or less similar, but they differ in various ways. So you see just a smattering of examples here: a state where reality is inferior to the goal, deviation from expected and desired results, or an unacceptable difference between expected and observed performance. In all of the definitions, the ones that we just exhibited on the last slide, but also in others that you find, failure is understood relative to a norm or an ideal. So something like a goal or an expected performance or the correct solution. There's something held up as a standard, and that failure is marked by falling short of meeting that standard, falling short of meeting that norm or realizing the ideal. Right now, it's important to keep in mind that falling short sort of by itself is not necessarily a problem. I think, are probably all familiar with formulating what we might think of as an aspirational goal, right? One that we know we're probably not going to achieve. And, we may set it so high that we know we can't achieve it. So falling short of it might actually qualify as a huge success. So falling short by itself isn't essentially failure. What marks it as failure, though, is if the goal that you've set, the norm, the standard, is something you desire, something you intend, or something you expect to achieve. So then if you fall short, it generates the kind of disappointment that's sort of the phenomenological aspect of failure. For the purposes of our project, Dina and I decided, instead of choosing one of these more specific definitions of failure from the various literatures that we canvassed, we'd formulate it more broadly. And so we came up with the idea of just describing something as failed if it didn't work as planned. This very general way of conceiving of failure can accommodate major and catastrophic failures, resulting in the end of a project or the collapse of a bridge or what have you, or they could be more minor that involve a revision in the project plans, but the project continues moving forward. It's also important to recognize that plans can disappoint at almost any stage of a project, from the very beginning to the very end. The failures, more specifically, can manifest in a variety of ways in the life of a project, right? It might not get off the ground, right? So you have plans to pursue some idea that you are very excited about, but the project just doesn't get off the ground. Maybe it gets off the ground, but you realize that you don't have the correct personnel for the project. The team you put together isn't going to be capable of achieving the objectives that you set for yourself. Or maybe it is, but ultimately the objectives you set for yourself weren't the objectives you actually wound up achieving, right? You had to kind of modify the objectives on the fly. And then the final bullet here is a kind of falling short or failure that is especially distinctive of cross-disciplinary projects, so inter and transdisciplinary projects. You might want to achieve some transdisciplinary goal or some interdisciplinary goal, but wind up, unfortunately, just producing disciplinary products, right? So instead of achieving the level of integration you'd hope for, you wind up generating a whole bunch of stuff, producing a whole bunch of stuff, but it just doesn't measure up to the integrated sort of ITD standard that you hope to achieve in the project. Now, here, just like before, it's important to kind of emphasize that not all disappointed plans are failures, right? Or or let's put it differently, not all plans that don't come to pass are failures, right? That every project I suspect you've ever worked on, certainly every project I've ever worked on, requires adjustment on the fly, right? I mean, we're all familiar. We write grants, right? Write proposals for funding for our projects, and a proposal is essentially a prediction of the scope of work you're going to pursue if you get the money. But I don't know what your experience is like, but certainly for me, every proposal that I've ever written had to be adjusted once the money came in, right? And for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it's usually many months from the writing of the proposal to the receipt of the funds. And the world changes under your feet in ways that require that you change the project that you're pursuing. So you have to modify projects on the fly. You have to be responsive to changes of circumstance. Not all of those responses are going to be failures, right? So what we really need to be focusing on then is a more sort of precise rendering of that formula, right? Maybe the plans that didn't come to pass, right, that you didn't meet or didn't successfully execute were substantive. Maybe they were really kind of what defined the project, right? So if you fail to execute those plans, that really does feel like failure. Or you have to make some sort of fundamental change to the project plan. So the project you envisioned yourself pursuing turns out not to be the project you're actually pursuing. So these are more the kinds of plans that I'm imagining here, the kinds of plans I'm describing are more than just the let's meet on Wednesday at noon kind of plan, right? But something a little bit more baked into the nature of the project. So to kind of summarize the conceptualizing failure part of this presentation and connect it up with the work that Jason and I have been doing. So in this, what we really want to do in this presentation is demonstrate how data about failures in inter and transdisciplinary projects can serve as a resource for insight into ITD success, right? So again, if you conceptualize failure in the way that we've suggested, lying behind the failure will be the standards, will be the norms that are constitutive of inter and transdisciplinary success, right? So we should be able to use failure as a lens on those norms, on those standards. And that's where the institutional grammar tool comes in. It provides us with a method that we can use to kind of extract the success conditions out of the stories of failure. So where did we get our stories from? Well, we got them from the survey that Dina and I conducted back in 2019. So when we developed the survey, we hoped to answer two research questions. First, do collaborative interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects fail more frequently than collaborative disciplinary research projects? That was again our hunch at the meal in Lüneburg. We hope to use the survey to inform, gather information that would help us address that and evaluate that hunch. Secondly, we wanted to kind of identify and get information or data about patterns of failure in collaborative ITD projects. The presentation that we're involved in producing right now is really more closely related to the second research question than to the first, right? So we're trying to analyze patterns of ITD failure in order to identify standards that norm ITD success. The survey that we developed had 4 parts. The first part, it basically consisted of a preamble that provided the respondent with a sense of how we were conceptualizing failure, and also established that they actually participated in collaborative interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects. The second part focused on collaborative ITD work. How many of these projects did you participate in? Had any of them failed? What were those failures like? The third part turned their attention to collaborative disciplinary projects. Same set of questions. How many? Had any of them failed? What were the failures like? And then the final part involved asking them to compare their inter and transdisciplinary experiences with their disciplinary experiences. Today, what we're going to do is we are going to look at data that were generated in response to one question in the survey. That question was, briefly describe the ways you felt failure manifested in ITD projects. We wrote the survey back in 2019, and we obtained ethics approval for it from the University of Technology, Sydney. We posted it online using SurveyMonkey and distributed it to the community in a variety of ways through the Science of Team Science listserv, as I mentioned, Association for Interdisciplinary Studies listserv, and others. Dina and I also produced a blog post for I2 Insights, Gabriele's blog, that described the survey and invited people to participate in it. The survey was open from April to August 2019. We received 142 at least partial responses and 91 responses to the question du jour, the question that we're focusing on today. We did not collect demographic data. We were thinking of the survey as a very preliminary one, and so the demographic data weren't as important to us as just getting responses to some of these questions. With that, I will turn things over to Dr. Pryor.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for everyone in Utrecht for coming to our presentation today. Sorry, that moment then was we just had to change over mics and all those sort of things. So there's a little bit of a moment there. So building on what Michael has just, he's set up an incredible context for what I'm about to present, and it's really, I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also grateful to Dina, who has been involved in earlier stages with us and working through this project with us, and also Gabriele for chairing this session today. So I'll just start by just giving by giving a little bit of a background to the IGT, the Institutional Grammar Tool. So, and it is quite a complex tool, but it's more the norms and rules that I'll be talking about today that you need to focus on rather than the intense background to this tool. But I'll just give a bit of a background to it. So the Institutional Grammar Tool, or the IGT, is a powerful analytical method designed to dissect and to better understand the underlying rules and norms that shape behaviors in various contexts, such as ITD research. The Institutional Grammar Tool is particularly useful in policy analysis, in looking at things like norms, rules, and strategies, helping to clarify how different norms and rules interact with broader institutional frameworks, such as the practice of ITD research. My goal in this presentation, this particular part here in this presentation, is to use the Institutional Grammar Tool to systematically analyze and understand the norms and rules used by the 91 ITD experts from the Survey on Failure in ITD Research. So that's the 91 who answered that question number 4. So that's my key aim here. So I'm sorry, wait a second. So just before I start moving into that, as a way of helping you understand how to use the IGT, let's analyze this ITD expert statement. It's the one in italics there. It's slightly modified so that no one can identify where the statement came from. So using the Institutional Grammar Tool. So this statement, if you want to read it while I'm talking, this statement highlights the collaboration, that collaboration fails when expectations and roles aren't clearly defined early on. So what I want to do is just quickly break this down to give people an understanding of the different components of the Institutional Grammar Tool that go into the analysis and identification of each of the norms or rules, which in the case here, we're going to align norms and rules as the same thing for the simplicity of this discussion. The distinction between a norm and a rule generally is that a rule will have an external consequence, while a norm has an internal consequence. That is, we adhere to a norm because we believe we should, whilst a rule will be something like, if you park here, you will get a fine of $100. So it's more external, but there's a bit of a blurred line here, so I'll talk about both just together in this sense. So if we just look at that one statement there by one of the ITD experts, there's the first part of it is the attribute. Attribute is a complex name for actually the person who performs it, the norm. So here it refers to the project lead or team member responsible for setting expectations in the case of this one. The next one, again, is a complex word, deontic, but it is just referring to such words as should, must not, or may. So in this case, they should clarify expectations and rules in terms of this italics, the statement here. The other one is all norms and rules have an aim. So this is another component of a norm and rule. And the aim here is to ensure clear roles and functions. But also norms and rules have conditions. They occur in places and time. So in the context, what's mentioned in this one statement here is this must happen at the project start. And then this is the comment about the or else, which can be internal or externally imposed. In the case here, if you read this statement, if not done, that is, if the collaboration or the effort to enhance collaboration is not done, there's the risk that the collaboration fails. So that's the or else consequence of this norm and rule. So if we move to the next slide, and this is what I'll talk about mostly, are these condensed forms of norms and rules today. So the slide before gave you an idea of the process we went through to get each of these norms and rules. On this slide, we're looking at the consolidated form of the norm and rule discussed on the previous slide. This is where we bring the various parts of the structured analysis back to a coherent statement. So this consolidated statement outlines a critical rule. Project leaders and team members must clarify key project aspects from the start to establish clear roles. By doing so, they set the foundation for effective collaboration and shared knowledge creation. So that's how this would translate into a more fluid discussion. A key outtake here is that each of the norms and rules which I'll be talking about today act as both a guide of how to achieve success, but also as a warning. So if ITD experts adhere to the norms, they set their projects up for success. But if they don't, they risk the project's collaborative goals and knowledge's outcomes failing. So adherence to the norms and rules directly impact project success in ITT research. So before I go into the core norms and rules which were identified through this analysis, I just want to give some context on how we got there, some basic context. So this slide provides an overview of how we selected the core norms and rules used by the 91 ITD experts to explain failure in ITD research. We focused on norms and rules that were mentioned by 3 or more interviewed ITD experts, ensuring that our analysis covered the most critical and widely recognized ones. And this is important because if it's only identified by one person, it could just be a strategy. If it's identified by more than one, by a couple of people, it generally tends to indicate that it's more like a norm. It's something that more people know about. So the selected norms and rules represented core rules and norms that shape interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research projects from the perspective of these ITD experts that we talked with, or that were talked with through the survey. Whilst we identified over 150 norms and rules operating in all their discussions, in all the participants' responses to question 4, these could be reduced to 9 core norms and rules used by those experts. And by core, we mean breaking them down, taking out all the detailed context, or times and things like that, and narrowing them down to their core essence in a sense. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually, and you can read these as I speak to each of them, I'm going to run through each of the 9 core norms and rules that were identified by the ITD experts. So this slide presents the norm and rule number 1 at the top, which using the institutional grammar tool. So this norm and rule is focused on the project team and its responsibility to integrate diverse ideas and viewpoints in order to achieve inter and transdisciplinarity throughout the project. Failure to meet this responsibility leads to missed opportunities and frustration among the team members. By breaking the statement into its IGT components, we can clearly see how each element contributes to the team's obligations and potential consequences of non-compliance. So in terms of norm and rule 2, the responsibilities lie with project participants to listen to others, facilitating the integration of diverse ideas throughout the project. Using the institutional grammar tool, we can see that failure to listen and integrate leads to a lack of collaboration and the project failing to reach its goals. This statement emphasizes the necessity of active listening and participation for success of ITD research. So I'll now move to the third one. So Norman Rule 3 focuses on the role of project leads or leaders. Using the IGT framework, this statement highlights that leaders must communicate expectations clearly to ensure that the project participants are aligned and to prevent discontent and misaligned outcomes. Failure to do so can lead to dissatisfaction and misunderstanding as the project progresses. So I'll now move to the next 3. So the fourth Norman Rule focuses on the involvement of researchers and partners in co-designed interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects. This statement, using the IGT framework, the institutional grammar tool, stresses the importance of meaningful involvement from the start of the project. If this involvement is not achieved, cooperation becomes difficult and results are less likely to be implemented. So I'll move now to Norm 5. The Norm Rule 5, the responsibility is placed on government bodies in supporting research agendas. So this is slightly different. This one actually moves outside of the sort of the research team in itself and the research interaction. It's more, and this came up quite a lot throughout the experts' comments about the role of government in particular. And that is, this statement emphasizes that when presented with integrated agendas, such as those related, for example, to food, health, and the environment, government bodies should provide support. Failure to do so can lead to the rejection of the agenda and lack of funding for important research initiatives. And so this is quite an important one about the framing and support of ITD research. So rule number 6 emphasizes the responsibilities of the research team to adapt their approaches when initial strategies do not meet participants' needs. So by applying the IGT, that's the institutional grammar tool analysis, we see that failure to adapt leads to blocked progress and frustration, ultimately undermining the effectiveness of the research project. Adapting approaches ensures that the team remains responsive and effective in addressing the dynamic needs of the participants. So I'll go now to the last 3. So the Norm Rule number 7 centers on the responsibilities of ITD research project teams to align their disciplinary interests in order to ensure collaborative and relevant research. This alignment must happen during the project development phase. If not, collaboration will suffer, leading to unmet project goals. The institutional grammar tool analysis here underscores how critical it is for these teams to proactively align their objectives and their disciplinary objectives. Norm Rule 8 focuses on project teams and their responsibilities to understand and manage uncertainty in research processes. By applying the institutional grammar tool framework, we observe that project teams must effectively handle diverse theories and contexts. So this is slightly different to disciplines, obviously, and other things. And we've tried to differentiate these. Failure to do so leads to poor research outcomes and team management issues, making this statement critical for research success. And so now for the final Norman Rule, which is number 9. So this one focuses on practice partners. Practice partners, here's a term we've created here. It means all the broad stakeholders involved in a project, but they're actually practicing partners. It could include community members and others who have experience and knowledge. So Rule this Norman Rule 9 focuses on practice partners who should participate from the start of the project to enable effective inter and transdisciplinary research. Failure to involve these partners early leads to poor communication and a lack of knowledge sharing, which hinders the project's success. The institutional grammar tool framework here shows the critical role practice partners play in research processes from the perspective of the experts in the survey. So in a sense, what we've done so far, we've identified 9 core rules and norms. But there's probably another step which is probably important here, and it's how do they start to relate to each other? Because, you know, it's one of the difficulties is how do I keep these if these 9 rules and norms are really important, how do I simultaneously keep them all in my head at once, and how do they relate to each other? So this next part of our analysis related to actually nesting all these norms and rules together to start looking at their relationships and how they interrelate and how they all move towards either success or failure. So this slide illustrates how the various norms and rules can be nested within a hierarchical structure. So at the top are the overarching goals, which focus on ensuring meaningful involvement by researchers and partners, which is Norman Rule 4, and government support for research agendas, that is Norman Rule 5. Sitting below that, below these goals are the supporting conditions where project leaders and practice partners establish the foundations for project success. And then below that, finally, the specific operational requirements. So what we've done here is we've started to break up all those components you saw before and look at them and how they relate to each other. So finally, the specific operational requirements, including active listening, for example, adaptive approaches and managing uncertainty, are vital for meeting these conditions, which are above, and achieving the overarching goals above that of the researchers and the partners in the projects and the governments and those sort of organizations. So how does this sort of nested hierarchy look? This is how it starts to look when you start to break it down into more of a diagrammatic overview. So this starts to suggest the flow chart from the top down. So this slide presents a diagrammatic overview of the nesting, describing how the various which were mentioned on the previous page, which include the overarching goals, which sit at the top, those 2 key boxes at the top, and supporting conditions, which are below that, and then also the specific requirements that lead to either failure or success. And those lead through to that bottom, which is either the failure or success through those processes. So this is where we're starting to bring together those and nest those norms and rules and give a bit more of an understanding of the flow of reasoning and action. So just to run through this again, the overarching goals, these are the high-level objectives where researchers, partners must ensure involvement at the top, rule number 4, and government bodies should support research agendas, 5. Supporting conditions sit below that. Here, project leaders, which was rule number 3, and practice partners, which was rule number 9, establish essential conditions to enable project success, moving down to the requirements, the specific requirements, where these are the operational needs such as listening, adaptive approaches, and managing uncertainty, which was in norm rule 2, 6, 7, and 8. I'm not expecting you to know the numbers. I'm just trying to explain the interrelationship of those. So together, these nested elements highlight the layers of collaboration from broad objectives to specific actions necessary for effective outcomes, or if they're not effective, failure. So, so that was a lot of information in a very short period of time. And it is something I've been in discussion with Dina and Michael, and it's been, for us even to work through this has been quite considerable. So I just highlight that point at this point. But what I'd like to finish this bit of the presentation with is just talking about some of the key findings and implications that has come out of this. And just because of the speaker arrangement we've got here, Michael and I have agreed that I will do these at this point, even though it has Michael and Jason written up the top, just for simplicity reasons. So this final slide summarizes the key findings and implications from our overall analysis. So just in terms of objectives, the main objective was to show how failure data can provide valuable insights into the factors influencing inter and transdisciplinary project outcomes. By examining failure data, we gain a better understanding of what contributes to ITD success or failure. And that's what we're hoping to have addressed in this presentation, how you can do this. Methodologically, we found that the institutional grammar tool was an effective tool for identifying norms and rules contributing to inter and transdisciplinary failure or success. And some of the key findings. The analysis highlights that adherence to norms and rules is crucial. And this is coming from the voices of the ITD experts discussing the norms and in their responses in question 4 that we analysed. It shows that people fail when they don't follow established norms, but they succeed when they do. Additionally, the findings reveal interdependencies, and this comes more to the nesting example I was giving, the interdependencies among rules, norms, and behaviours, emphasising how these elements are interwoven and essential for ITD success. And I think a point just to mention here when I'm talking about the interdependencies, one of the factors which is true about all norms and rules is that some of these norms and rules may not be specific to ITD research. They might cross boundaries. And for example, ITD research might be subject to other rules. I always think of, some rules like, a basic rule in society, thou shalt not kill. It generally applies to all activities in the world. So it sort of frames, it's an extreme example, but there are norms which sit around the types of norms which I've just explained, which also other broader norms which these are nested within. So just the next point, there are also implications here, clear implications for things like guidance documents and policies around ITD research and practice, and the idea that there's a whole series of key points about clear communication. There's implications about clear communication, early participation, adaptive strategies, and the norms and rules themselves could be explained and identified as part of policies and documents to help people understand these are common practices which everyone's identifying, or at least these 91 experts that we were interviewed identified. So in conclusion, I'd just like to point out that the 9 core norms and rules identified here should not come as a surprise to ITD practitioners, as they align with the normative principles often discussed in ITD research. So I just wanted to finish on that point. By what I meant by that is that you might have looked at those norms and rules, said, oh yeah, I know that one. I know that one. And that's actually a good sign that we're actually possibly touching on the norms and rules and identifying them, starting to identify them if people are identifying with those norms and rules. So I'll finish there and hand over now to Gabriele, and we'll just go back to a group view, and I'll take down the slides. So.
Thanks, Jason and Michael, for a tour de force through an important study.